In the heart of the 19th century, as steamships ruled the oceans and locomotives carved through the English countryside, an invisible force began to pulse beneath the surface of empires. This was not fire, coal, or steel, but something even more. Transformative. The telegraph. It was England that first recognized the full potential of this miraculous invention, a system that would shrink the world and bring colonies, cities, and continents into near-instant communication in a way that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The story begins with a set of brilliant and determined minds, men of science and vision who saw messages transmitted not by horse or ship, but by the snap of electric current, men like Charles Wheatstone and William Fothergill. Cook, who would pioneer the first successful commercial telegraph system in England, with the birth of the Great Western Railway as their proving ground. Their early system used 5 needles pointing to letters on a board, though cumbersome it was. Revolutionary in 1837, they filed their patent, and a new age quietly dawned beneath the feet of Victorians who could not yet imagine how deeply it would change the world. The railways became not just a symbol of industrial might, but a circulatory system, for this electric lifeblood wires began running alongside tracks crossing the green fields of Surrey and stretching toward the smoke-blackened skies of London. Soon messages that once took days to deliver could be sent in minutes. The Victorian public was stunned, and newspapers began to report on the feats of this strange new power that allowed someone in Paddington to communicate with Slough in real time. Business owners leaped at the opportunity. Contracts, orders, shipments now sped forward, not on carts but through copper threads. This was the birth of what some would call the Victorian Internet, the beginning of a world wired not just for industry, but for thought, ideas, and influence the government. Two took notice, understanding that such speed could reshape diplomacy, war, and governance. In 1844, the Electric Telegraph Company was founded, the first public telegraph company in the United Kingdom, and by the 1850s, telegraph offices began appearing in cities, towns, and eventually villages, as common as the corner post box, but far more mysterious. As the network expanded, so too did its ambitions. England's empire stretched across the globe, and with it came a desire to knit its far-flung territories together, not just in governance or commerce, but in conversation. The dream of connecting London to India, to Canada, to Australia became more than fantasy. It became policy. Undersea cables were the next frontier, and they posed unimaginable challenges. Engineers had to design cables strong enough to withstand the crushing pressure of the ocean floor, and yet delicate enough to carry the faint electric whispers of human language. The first major triumph came in 1851 with a cable connecting Dover to Calais, bringing England into direct contact with France. It was a short cable by later standards, but a monumental leap across the channel from there. Ambitions soared, and a network of underwater arteries began to form, threading through the Atlantic, Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean. By the 1860s, England had laid the groundwork for a global web of communication, faster than any sailing ship, and more reliable than any messenger pigeon in this web. Every cable was a lifeline, every message a heartbeat of empire. Whether it was instructions to a governor in Bombay, stock prices for a banker in the city, or news of a war breaking out in Sudan, the telegraph was the unseen force holding it all together. But the system was not without flaws. Messages had to be manually relayed at stations, decoded and re-encoded, meaning that human error, delays, and confusion could still creep in. The language of telegraphy became an art form in itself, with codified phrases, abbreviations, and numerical systems developed to save time and cost. Every word mattered. Every signal was money. Every dot and dash had weight and value. Journalists began to call the telegraph wire the nervous system of the world, and they were not wrong. Through this invisible web, England began to see itself, not just as an island or even an empire, but as a central node in a living, breathing network of global affairs. And while much of the telegraph's power served the machinery of commerce and control, it also brought with it a strange new intimacy. Between peoples who might never meet an Englishwoman in Manchester could receive word of her brother in Madras, a father in Liverpool could learn within hours of a shipwreck near Tasmania that might have claimed his sons. This power to connect and console, to warn and inform, was unlike anything the world had known before, and it was still just beginning. As the telegraph spread like veins across the globe, it brought with it not only technical innovation, but also social transformation. England found itself at the center of a communications revolution that redefined how people perceived time, distance, and urgency. No longer were events isolated by geography. A rebellion in Delhi could be known in Whitehall within hours, not weeks. And such immediacy demanded a new pace of decision-making across the empire. Politicians, generals, and merchants had to adapt to a world that moved at the speed of electricity. It was as if time itself had been accelerated in the corridors of power. The telegraph was hailed as a tool of dominion, an invisible chain binding colonies to the crown. But to the average citizen, it became a window to the wider world. Newspapers began publishing telegraph sections, condensing global news into quick, crisp bulletins from Africa to Asia, and the Americas' readers now consumed international affairs daily, no longer needing to wait weeks for printed journals from abroad. The spread of this Victorian Internet also reshaped the profession's entire. Classes of workers emerged to support it. Telegraph clerks, linemen operators, and translators who understood the unique language of wires. These people became the unsung pioneers of a connected world, often working under intense pressure decoding messages in real time through the clatter of Morse keys and relay machines. Among them were women who found employment in telegraph offices as operators, proving themselves invaluable to the industry, even as society debated their presence in the workforce. This democratization of communication roles hinted at a broader societal change, one in which speed, information, and precision began to eclipse tradition, hierarchy, and routine. Meanwhile, engineers were pushing the boundaries of what the system could do. Each new line brought new problems, from sabotage by animals or hostile forces to technical failures caused by storms and faulty insulation. Yet these setbacks only inspired more durable innovations. Gutta percha and insulating rubber, harvested from Southeast Asia, became critical to undersea cable durability. Laying a single cable could take months and require the coordination of ships, divers, and massive spools of copper, but each success brought the world closer together. The crowning achievement of Victorian telegraphy came with the completion of the transatlantic cable after failed attempts in the 1850s. It was in 1866 that the Great Eastern, a steamship of immense proportions, finally succeeded in laying a working cable between Ireland and Newfoundland. It was a moment of awe and celebration. In England, crowds gathered to witness the first official messages, and newspapers declared the world had been halved in an instant. Queen Victoria herself sent a congratulatory message to President Andrew Johnson, an act symbolic of diplomacy entering a new era. Messages that once took 10 days by ship could now arrive in minutes. The implications were enormous. Financial markets became more synchronized, military operations more coordinated, and empires' more centralized control could now be exerted with a near godlike immediacy from London over distant lands. This incredible advancement, however, also introduced new challenges. Espionage became easier as sensitive data could be intercepted on the wire, political dissent could spread faster, and mistakes could cascade through networks at alarming speed. Still, the march of progress continued. Unimpeded cables now connected London to Cairo, Calcutta, Melbourne, and even Hong Kong, creating a nervous system for an empire upon which the sun famously never set. But it was not just empires that were transformed. So too were the lives of ordinary people. Marriage proposals, condolences, news of births and deaths all traveled. On this electric current, lovers separated by oceans could whisper their thoughts through wires, and soldiers on the front could send word home to anxious families in ways never possible before the telegraph altered the very emotional landscape. of society, and with it, a new sense of global citizenship began to emerge. People started to care about events far from their hometowns. Wars, famines, elections, and coronations all carried emotional resonance because the telegraph made them feel. Close, immediate, and real, it is hard to overstate how this Victorian Internet quietly rewrote the rules of engagement between nations and individuals alike, creating not just a faster world, but a smaller one, an interconnected human web that defied geography and defied the past. As England deepened its reliance on the telegraph, the technology began to affect not just how messages were sent, but also how decisions were made across politics, commerce, and even warfare. The military was among the first to fully appreciate the strategic power of the wire during the Crimean War. Though the system was still in its infancy, commanders and politicians felt the lag in updates from the front. By the time the Indian Rebellion of 1857 erupted, the British realized that the telegraph could mean the difference between swift suppression and disastrous delay soon. Military lines were laid alongside commercial ones, and garrisons in colonial territories were equipped with their own signal stations, allowing for direct contact with Whitehall in times of crisis decisions that once took weeks of deliberation, and travel were now compressed into hours. This changed the nature of imperial rule, giving central authorities unprecedented control over distant events. But it also meant that errors could multiply quickly. An incorrect report, a misread code, a hasty decision, all could spiral into consequences across oceans. Yet the benefits outweighed the risks, and so the web expanded daily by the 1870s. A new generation of cables known as all red routes, named for the red-colored territories of the British Empire on world maps, formed a strategic communication network under British control. This network ensured that England's messages did not have to pass through foreign nations, a crucial safeguard in times of diplomatic tension or war. Such infrastructure made Britain not only a colonial power, but a communications superpower, directing traffic from multiple continents through London offices where thousands of clerks tapped away at telegraph keys, processing an avalanche of global information. The London Central Telegraph Office became a marvel of its time, a humming cathedral of connectivity, where messages streamed in from New Zealand, Singapore, South Africa, and Canada 24 hours a day. It was here that the invisible bonds of empire were managed and maintained by men and women whose names never appeared in the history books, but whose work shaped the destiny of millions. Even as telegraph traffic increased, so did its cultural impact. Plays, novels, and newspapers referenced the telegraph as a symbol of modernity and change. People were both fascinated and unsettled by the technology. Some feared that the speed of the telegraph would make people impatient, shallow, and reactive. Others believed it would unite humanity through shared knowledge and faster diplomacy. The technology found itself at the heart of debates about morality. Speed and truth scandals could now travel as fast as official news, and rumors could be spread across cities in moments, creating moral panics or political crises in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, businesses thrived under the new paradigm. Insurance companies used the telegraph to assess damages. Banks used it to move funds, and markets watched the wires for the latest shifts in grain prices. Or gold reserves, the London Stock Exchange became wired to other major cities, allowing for a new kind of speculative trading based not on cargo and shipping schedules, but on rapid news and reaction. The age of the slow deal was ending, and the telegraph had ushered in a new economy of urgency and volatility at home. Telegraph offices became commonplace in cities and towns, and citizens learned to write messages in short, clipped phrases to save money and space. A new grammar emerged, full of abbreviations, urgency, and directness that would one day echo in text messages and emails. Children were taught the basics of Morse code in school, and telegraph games became part of public exhibitions and fairs. The romance of distance began to fade as people learned they were never truly alone. A heartbeat of news or emotion was always a wire away. This brought comfort to some and anxiety to others as the telegraph subtly rewired the human relationship with presence and silence, with space and solitude. It was not only the world map that changed, but the human psyche itself as the century marched on. So did the technology, and the men behind it began to consider even more ambitious ideas. Including wireless transmission, though. The future would bring radio and telephone. It was the telegraph that had first laid the foundations of this invisible world, a world where thought could travel faster than any man, beast, or machine. A world connected not by roads or rails, but by pulses of electricity beneath the ground and sea through the mountains and across deserts. This was the Victorian Internet, and its story was far from over. By the final decades of the 19th century, the telegraph had embedded itself into nearly every facet of English life, from the highest offices of power to the humblest country post house. The wires carried more than mere words. They carried emotion, fear, hope, and authority. They crackled with the daily heartbeat of an empire at its height. And a society in constant transformation, the global telegraph network was now so vast that delays of even a few minutes were considered critical in high-level affairs, and such urgency bred innovation. The British government created regulatory bodies to monitor cable quality, line maintenance, and message integrity, ensuring that the reliability of the system was not compromised in a world growing dependent on instant communication. Even more importantly, education began to shift around. The New World Order children were now taught not only literature and arithmetic, but also geography with an emphasis on cable routes and major telegraph junctions. Understanding how the empire was wired became as important as knowing its territorial boundaries. Meanwhile, a new form of diplomacy emerged known as telegraphic diplomacy, where negotiations occurred in real time across continents. Ambassadors and colonial governors no longer waited for written instructions. They followed directives. Sent through the flicker of Morse keys, diplomacy became faster but also more volatile, as decisions made in the heat of the moment now reached distant officials before careful reflection could occur. The telegraph also began to influence journalism. In ways previously unthinkable, reporters raced to telegraph offices after covering major events, hoping to be the first to wire their dispatch to London. The result was a new kind of fast-paced breaking news that kept readers hooked, and advertisers, spending the Times, Reuters, and other news agencies, thrived under this model, hiring local correspondents stationed in telegraph-equipped cities across the globe. These correspondents became the eyes and ears of the British public, reporting on everything from wars to weather, and their words carried weight because they arrived quickly. The Victorian appetite for speed was insatiable, and the telegraph fed it daily. Yet not all saw the change as positive. Some intellectuals warned of a society growing too accustomed to reaction rather than reflection, where the flood of information left little room for wisdom and silence. Religious leaders debated whether the telegraph was a divine gift or a dangerous temptation to pride and haste. But regardless of opinion, the system kept expanding. Cables reached remote islands, mountain villages, and desert outposts, until the empire seemed not only to span the globe in territory, but also in thought. Every outpost connected back to London, and from London to the world. By 1890, the telegraph had reached such maturity that the concept of real-time global communication was no longer a wonder, but an expectation. And with that shift came new industries, new responsibilities, and new risks. Cybersecurity, as we know it today, was still far away, but even in Victorian times, fears about message interception and manipulation were growing. Encrypted codes became common, especially in military and commercial contexts, and new devices were invented to increase transmission speed and prevent unauthorized access. By now, the telegraph had achieved something even railways could not. It made the world psychologically smaller and emotionally Immediate, even without photographs or live video, the mere presence of a message from across the world could shape public opinion, mobilize governments, or shift markets. It was the pulse of modern life beating through the veins of copper and gutta, percha, and it changed not only how England ruled, but how it imagined its place in the universe. Children dreamed of becoming telegraph operators, the way others dreamed of becoming soldiers or explorers, for to master the wire was to be a navigator. Of the invisible, a conductor of empire and memory in the hum of the Victorian Internet became the lullaby of an era on the brink of even greater transformations as the 20th century approached and the whispers of new technologies stirred. In the air, the telegraph stood as both foundation and prophecy, a monument to the power of connection. As the sun set on the Victorian era, the legacy of the telegraph stood tall, not merely as an invention, but as a revolution that had altered the very fabric of global interaction. It had transformed England from an island nation into the nervous center of a pulsating worldwide network. The telegraph had made it possible for empires to manage continents, for businesses to operate across oceans, and for ordinary people to feel close to those thousands of miles away. Its invisible lines connected not only cities but hearts and minds. It had turned time from a barrier into a tool and distance, from an obstacle into an afterthought. Yet even as it reached its zenith, the telegraph began to sense the coming winds of change. The first wireless messages crackled across short distances, hinting at a world where even the cables that ran under seas and through valleys might someday be obsolete. Visionaries like Guglielmo Marconi began to demonstrate that radio waves could carry messages without wires, and with that revelation, the future whispered itself into existence. But the foundation, the philosophy, the global mindset of connectivity had already been laid by the Victorian telegraph. Its real triumph was not in technology alone, but in the reshaping of human expectations. No longer would the world be content with slow silence in the face of urgency. The people of the 20th century would be born into a world where information moved faster than memory, and where knowledge was only a moment away from action. For England, the telegraph had brought unprecedented control over its empire, yet it also sowed the seeds of its own decentralization as colonies became more aware, more informed, and more connected. They began to see their place in the imperial system with new clarity, and eventually new resistance. Knowledge, once hoarded by a central power, now flowed with growing ease to all corners of the world, sparking ideas, movements, and eventually revolutions. In this way, the telegraph was both a tool of empire and a harbinger of independence. It was a weapon of control and a whisper of liberation. It changed warfare, diplomacy, finance, and love. It brought news of peace and word of death. It shrunk the globe, but expanded the imagination. It took the dreams of engineers and the electricity of storms, and it gave them voice through metal and pulse. In the end, the Victorian Internet stands as one of the greatest milestones in human communication, a moment when mankind chose to bind itself, not just by roads or treaties, but by thought made electric. It created the first true global village, and its echoes still ripple through the world we live in today. Every text message, every email, every satellite transmission is a descendant of that original dream, a world connected not by the might of armies, but by the speed of light, by the desire to speak, to hear, to know, and to be known. And though the wires may have rusted and the Morse keys may have gone silent, the story of the Victorian telegraph lives on in the endless conversation it began.